Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. Delighted to be here. I'm going to, as Dan said, I want to spend most of my time answering questions, but I want to just make it very clear first at the start of why the heck am I out here? I represent the 6th district out in southern suburban Illinois. When I first came in 2018, it had some rural areas out in McHenry. It's now much more suburban. Long way from here. I'm pretty sure no one who can vote for me is anywhere in this room. I've been in Congress now. I'm starting my 4th term. Came in won in 2018. Came in 19. It has been a fascinating time to be in Congress, to be there for the passage of the biggest climate bill in our country's history, the biggest infrastructure bill in our nation's history, to be there for the 2nd biggest collapse of our economy in our history, second only to the Great Depression, and the fastest recovery in our nation's history, which I think we had some agency in making sure that happens. I have also served in 3 terms in Congress, in half the impeachments that have ever happened in our country, half the attacks on the U.S. Capitol that have ever happened in our country, 100% of the evicted speakers and 20% of the evicted members. Thank you, George Santos. It has been history-making in every sense of the word. I have absolutely no political experience other than Congress. I never took a poli-sci class. I never ran for any office before running for Congress. And if you would have asked me what political party I was 15 years ago, I'm not sure I would have known how to answer the question. I'm a chemical engineer by training. Had built and run a number of companies that we went into industrial facilities and would take over their energy assets and make them more efficient. And then we'd haggle over how much of every dollar I got to keep from my shareholders and how much we had to pay them in order to have continuing rights to their facility. But we did things at ethanol plants in the Midwest, colleges and universities, paper mills, chemical plants, you name it. If it was energy intensive, steel mills, we were in there. We did that, number one, because I enjoyed it. It was fun engineering. But also because I basically grew up deathly afraid that climate change was going to be the defining feature of my generation. And if we couldn't find a way to save people money and address climate change, we weren't going to get this done. And as someone I was born in 1971, so the first president I really remember was Dixon's native son. As a kid, I remember the big environmental crisis. The first one that I really remember was the ozone hole. And I give Ronald Reagan a lot of credit for saying we need to use markets to solve these problems. We can't just have command and control measures, and this is a global problem. We have to get the world to deal with this. And so under the Reagan White House, they developed the Montreal Protocol, which was a cap-and-trade system. That worked so well that then when New England was concerned about sugar maple trees dying because of acid rain, they developed the same program for a national program, which became the Acid Rain Trading Program. People thought, all the environmentalists, candidly all the Democrats, were saying it was going to cost minimum $500 a ton to reduce acid rain. It came in at less than $5 almost immediately because of the programs that the Reagan and then later the Bush White House put together to use markets as tools to solve problems. I also remember when the airlines were deregulated and when telecoms were deregulated. And Fred Kahn, who had been the head of the Civil Aviation Administration when all that went through, had this wonderful statement he made years later, but it informed what the Reagan White House was doing. And he said the process of deregulation shifts the burden of consumer protection from price setting to antitrust enforcement. And deregulation fails if you drop the former and don't replace it with the latter. These were all ideas that were deep in the heart of the Republican Party I grew up with. And so the first time I could vote, I voted for H.W. Bush. The second time I could vote, I voted for Bob Dole, which isn't to say that I agreed with him on everything, but I was always fond of Ed Koch's line when he said, if you agree with 60% of what I have to say, vote for me. If you agree with 60% of what the other guy has to say, vote for him. And if you agree with 100% of whatever anybody has to say, you need to go get your head examined. And so that was sort of where I grew up. And I grew up with the idea that the Republican Party was not in any confusion about whether the good guys won the Cold War, whether the good guys won the Civil War. And after we'd sold our company in 2016, we were going to push for some additional market reforms. At this point, I was just helping friends who were still in the industry, trying to say, how do we get rid of some of the subsidies that are distorting the way energy markets work? And so I went to meet with my congressman at the time, Peter Roscom, and was making the case for why this is a business case for let's help people have cleaner, cheaper energy, and we're blocked by these regulations. And as we were making our arguments, he stood up, looked at his watch, and walked out of the room. And I said, what the heck is that? Like, that seems pretty rude. And I went home and I said to my wife, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but he's going to be unemployed by the time I figure out what I'm doing next. And I started talking to people, who were more politically involved than me at the time. And I thought that, I must have said something. And they said, no, that's his brand. He hadn't had a town hall in 10 years. He doesn't confront that. And when I found out that Darren LaHood, who's a friend, has not had a town hall since before I got elected, that felt problematic to me. And ultimately, the reason I'm here is because the democracy that our founders created is predicated on the idea that A, we're going to trust that if everybody votes, they will collectively make the right decision. And B, we're going to trust that when people get into the voting booth, they're going to have a full understanding of the positions of the various candidates, the issue on the ballots, and be informed. And we have never as a country lived up to either of those propositions, right? On a really good election in America, maybe we get 60% turnout. Goodness knows there's plenty of misinformation, and there's plenty of folks, including probably all of us in this room, including me, who may not know everything on every part of all the way down the ballot of exactly where the folks stand for. But our democracy moves forward to the extent that people are constantly fighting to make sure that everybody can vote and that everybody is fully informed when they get there. And our democracy has always been threatened by people who oppose both of those principles. And so I'm basically here today just to answer whatever questions you've got, not to convince you that I'm right, but I want you to understand what's going on in Washington, and you can make your own decision on whatever you do with that on the backside. As far as what I've got direct involvement, I'm happy to answer your question, anything, but since coming into Congress, I've served on the Climate Committee in the first 2 terms, where we wrote what substantially became the Inflation Reduction Act, so I'm fairly intimately familiar with that. I served on the Space Science Committee, where we overview all of our national labs and scientific research that funds other government, and the Financial Services Committee, where we oversee our nation's financial system, the banks, the Consumer Financial Protection Board. We were the ones on the phone calls when SVB was collapsing and we were wondering if we're going to have a run in the bank, lots of what's going on in crypto. So all those areas I can get really wonky on. Happy to get wonky on anything else as well. But this is your room, and here's to democracy. Thank you for coming, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Okay, this mic's going to be a little different here. So again, if you have questions, come over here. We'll have 5 people sit at a time, 1 question at a time. Okay. So first on up, and we'll have a volunteer. Yep.
That's our question or bear trap that we've.
Miriam?
All right.
I'm going to hold it.
Okay. Let's get wonky on Social Security. How do you propose to protect Social Security with all of the things that are happening right now?
So we're going to take 2 parts of the question, or I'm going to break it into 2 parts. There's a structural issue with Social Security, which we know how to solve, and we have legislation to do it. That Social Security has funded all of us pay into Social Security over the course of our lives, as you know, and then you need to have enough money in the corpus once you retire that it's out there. Because of shifts in demographics of the country, we're 10 to 15 years away from not having enough money in there. The easiest way to fix that, and John Larson from Connecticut has a bill, he's been pushing this for a while, is that you only pay into Social Security on your FICA taxes for the first, it changes with inflation, roughly $190,000 a year right now, which means that if you make $191,000, you pay just as much into Social Security on a total basis as Elon Musk does, because you only pay on the first $190,000 of your income. And so the fix, which is a fairly straightforward fix, is to say, well, let's take this very progressive program and stop funding it with a very regressive tax. And so what John Larson's bill has done is to say, well, we don't want to have sticker shock right away, so let's reimpose the FICA tax for all income above $450,000, and then over time, as that $190,000 inflates, we'll close the gap. But we're not squeezing people right in the middle immediately. And that largely solves the long-term solvency of both Social Security and Medicare. It's the right fix. I've co-sponsored that bill every term. We got very close to passing it and then didn't quite have the votes last term. And ultimately, we're going to have to do that. There's a separate problem we have right now that Congress, the legislative branch, writes the legislation. The White House, the executive branch, executes the legislation that we pass. And we've got a huge problem right now that the executive branch is not executing the laws, but some of my colleagues across the aisle feel we shouldn't be doing oversight. And so we are getting so many calls right now from constituents who are saying, there's nobody home at the Social Security agency anymore. They're not returning my calls. We need help sometimes for innocuous reasons. I've actually had, I think, 3 constituents who were declared dead and could not get their Social Security payments anymore. They were very much alive. We checked. And it was just because it was inadvertent. Somebody had swapped a digit in their Social Security number and they were filed a different way, right? Well, you can fix that, but you need someone online to fix it, right? And so these cuts in the agency are hurting folks that we need to go back, and we need to be doing better oversight in this moment. We need to be doing any oversight in this moment, which we can't do as long as Speaker Johnson is blocking our ability to have hearings and do those subpoenas. But this is a solvable problem as long as we're serious about making sure that the Congress itself is going to do its job and defend its status as a co-equal branch of government.
Yeah, hi, Congressman. I'm concerned with the tariffs, and shouldn't Congress be the one that's taking care of tariffs instead of the executive branch? That's my question.
So, yes, legally, what Trump has done on the tariffs is completely legal, because the law says and we can debate this, we can regret it. I think it was probably a mistake, but years ago, Congress gave authority to the White House to set tariff policy, and in particular, the White House has the authority to declare emergencies. The idea is that the declaration of an emergency sometimes needs immediate things to happen, and a political body is going to be slow to respond. However, the Emergency Powers Act says that if the White House declares an emergency, Congress can file a motion to declare that the emergency is over, and if Congress votes within 30 days to declare the emergency over, then you can't do it anymore. So the authority that Trump has used to issue these tariffs is declaring that there was an economic emergency. There's not one, but they declared one. For context, 6 weeks ago, the average tariff on goods in the United States was 1.5%. Today, even after some of the clawback, it's almost 30% of the tariff on imported goods. We haven't started to feel it yet, but you've got manufacturers who are now turning away ships that are coming in because they don't want to pay the import duty, and so you're going to start to see things that are dropping out. To get a sense of how bizarre Congress is right now, my colleague Greg Meeks from New York introduced a bill to say that there is no economic emergency, and that would have started the clock on 30 days. Maybe we wouldn't have the votes. The Republicans obviously have the majority. Maybe they would declare it's an economic emergency, but you'd have to have the vote at that point. Last week, a bill was passed on a straight party line vote to declare, among other things, that a calendar day is not a legislative day. So now, under the rules of this Congress, when the earth spins around on its axis, 24 hours, the sun rises, the sun sets, and the sun rises again, that is no longer a day. And so this Congress has now passed a bill that says, for the perspective of declaring an emergency over, we have chosen to neuter ourselves and say that Congress can't do that. To my mind, it's stupid, but it's also cowardly. If you agree there's an emergency, then fine, just vote for it, right? But they've now taken away Congress's ability, and when I say they, a straight party line vote, to simply have a vote of whether there is an emergency that could cancel the tariffs. And it's going to be hard because there's going to be some huge disruptions. There's an article in the paper today that heparin, I'm not going to ask any questions, but if any of you or if some of you may be familiar with this, if you've ever gone in for surgery and you can't eat, you get heparin. It's an anticoagulant, so that if you're being fed intravenously. The supply chains for heparin are almost entirely in China. So now you've got these tariffs that are kicking in, and let's assume only that the Chinese are going to engage in this in the way that Donald Trump would, which is say, I'm going to make you feel pain over this. If they were to shut off that supply, people will die within hours. Like this is a hugely problematic issue, and it's created by this tariff battle. Okay. So the answer is we have ways to restore the tariffs, but we need the House to agree to vote on repealing the emergency.
Yes, I'd like to have you explain exactly what we will need to vote and register to vote if the SAVE Act does go through the Senate.
So let me. I don't know the answer to that because it's entirely unclear in the language of the SAVE Act how they're going to do this. So what the SAVE Act says, this is a bill that did just pass the House on I think was almost a straight party line vote. What it says is that you cannot vote unless you can demonstrate that the name on you, that you have a federal ID and that the name on your ID matches your birth certificate. The first problem there is that 84% of married women in America do not have a last name that matches the name on their birth certificate. The legislation makes no provision for how that would be addressed. So it is entirely unclear in the legislation how that works. There's a second problem that anybody who's, well, I don't want to say anybody, a number of people who have been victims of domestic violence will have their name changed or otherwise be hiding their identity, and there's no provision to address those issues. The reason for the SAVE Act is ultimately not to protect not to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. I don't know if any of you remember the Breakfast Club. Remember the line when Anthony Michael Hawley's got the fake ID and he's like, you only made yourself 19 on your fake ID. He's like, yeah, I know. He's like, well, why do you have a fake ID? And he goes, to vote. Right? It was funny because that's a crazy reason to have a fake ID, right? like people do not, come to this country legally or illegally so that they can vote. But the scare around that has been useful because if you look at the population of people who have a very hard time getting access to a federally recognizable document, number one, most people don't have passports. Because if you're not at an income level or just the interest to travel abroad, you're not going to have a passport. An awful lot of people, I suspect some people in this room, don't actually know where your birth certificate is. Particularly for people who've become estranged from their parents for one reason or another. Maybe you lived in California and your house was just lost in the wildfire. Where's your birth certificate? Right. So there's huge populations of people who can't necessarily get that. And the test on that is that we actually introduced legislation last term that said, all right, let's address this straight on. Let's set a bill up that says anybody with a Social Security number can go to the post office and get a federally recognized ID. I have not been able to get anybody across the aisle to co-sponsor that legislation. Because ultimately the point of this is not to make sure that everybody can vote. It's to make sure that certain demographics of people struggle to vote. And that's unfortunately true.
I'm concerned about the loss of our First Amendment rights, and the people are being disappeared for their beliefs, or a number of things, law firms that defend people that don't agree with the current administration. And I'd like to know how we can preserve our freedom of speech.
So we are neck deep in a constitutional crisis right now. We are not in a constitutional crisis because the president disagrees on policy. We're neck deep in a constitutional crisis because the president is violating the Constitution and the law and is not being held to account. One of the first actions that they took was to get rid of birthright citizenship by executive order. Birthright citizenship is in the 14th Amendment. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment says that any natural-born citizen in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is an American citizen. The reason why it says subject to the jurisdiction thereof is because it had to exempt Native Americans who were not subject to the jurisdiction because they lived on tribes, and had to exempt people who were born of foreign ambassadors living in the United States and therefore not subject to the jurisdiction. But at the time that was drafted, there was actually a rich debate. This was done in the wake of the end of the Civil War and freeing the slaves, and said all these people are citizens now and have the right to vote. But they actually debated at the time, should this apply to all the Chinese laborers who are here building the railroad right now if they happen to have a child while they're here? And they said, yes, that's absolutely the intent. You can see this in the congressional record. That was actually what they debated. So now you have a White House that's saying we're going to repeal that by executive order, which, if you've watched Schoolhouse Rock, as I have, is not the way that the Constitution is amended. They're now moving on from that to as you said, prosecute people for their beliefs. That Secretary Rubio has just said that they want to do a purge of people in the State Department who do not hold Christian beliefs. Which, like, you're free to hold Christian beliefs, right? But, like, look at what our founders said. I mean, Jefferson famously said that you have an absolute right to believe whatever you want. The government's ability is only to limit your actions. So if you believe in a religion that demands human sacrifice, that's fine. If you participate in human sacrifice, that's not fine, right? You can't be prosecuted for your beliefs. These are basic, and we need to stand up for that. A handful of us have been, when I say handful, there's like 20 of us who got together after the last administration to start working with outside groups to pursue litigation in the courts. And the courts have, in generally, been very robust on this. On the birthright citizenship, on these other matters, they've been ruling in the right way. What's the plain text of the Constitution. It is concerning that some of these law firms are folding. We actually will be sending out a letter next week pointing out that a number of these law firms are probably breaking the law, because if you're essentially accepting a bribe from an official and doing your work based on that bribe, that is a violation of the law. We'll see how much that stands. But I think my basic message to everybody is I want to stress that this should be deeply, deeply bipartisan. If you are a university saying we really want to have a very diverse student body because it makes our university better, but I don't want to say that publicly because then my research funding will be cut off, I understand the fear. If you are a law firm saying I don't want to get in a fight with the White House because if I get in a fight with them, some of our clients will run to other law firms and we won't be able to make our partner bonuses this year, I understand that fear. If you are a member of Congress, including many on both sides of the aisle, who is saying, I'm afraid to stand up right now because having freed the January 6th people who attacked our police, having freed them from jail, I don't want to be doxxed and have people outside my house threatening the safety of my family if I stand up. I understand that fear. When you are faced with those threats and you are being told if you stand up individually, you will be picked off, you have two choices. You can either sit down or you can stand up collectively. And we have gotten to this point and succeeded as a country to date because when we've hit moments like this in the past, we've stood up collectively.
My question
question's a little long, but I think there's some education as part of it. And first of all, I want to thank you for being brave enough to show up. Secondly, I'm worried. I'm worried about our national security and the apparent lack of concern and action by our elected officials, both sides. You are, I believe, on the National Security Committee.
I'm not, no.
Not anymore?
No.
Some internet. Okay. Meanwhile, our MIA GOP representative is a member of the National Intelligence Committee. And at least he is receiving and is aware of our country's vulnerabilities to cyber attacks, spy activities, potential terrorist actions, and our other enemies, including Russia and China. But with the distraction of the daily fire hose of horrors, nobody seems to be raising the alarm of what most certainly is happening very quietly as our enemies infiltrate into our electrical grids, our banking systems, and our healthcare systems, and our crumbling military leadership. So my question, I'm saying, my hair is on fire. My question is, who's raising the alarm about what's going on behind the curtain? Who's standing in front of the cameras, and where's the cavalry?
I will first, just to make you, I don't know if this will make you feel better or worse. I remember when Adam Schiff was heading up the Intel Committee, I asked him, what's it like being on the Intel Committee? And he said basically everybody who comes in says, I'm going to tell you something that's going to scare the dickens out of you about the future of our country. Then I'm going to tell you something that's going to scare the dickens out of you about the future of the world. And then we're going to get to the scary part. And I think the nature, and I say that not to be dismissive of it, but we should be deeply afraid of these threats, because to the extent we're deeply afraid of these threats, we take protective measures and they don't happen. But people are trying to hack into our systems all the time. We have robust, not just our own domestic services, but the intelligence assets we have to try to protect against that in coordination with our partners around the world. And it has taken generations to build that. Like anything, the world's best home builder can build a house in a year. The world's worst arsonist can burn it down in a day. And I think we need to be very careful about what's happening right now. Some of the things that particularly scare me are, number one, the hack into the Treasury payment system from Elon Musk and these folks. We still don't know, because we've been blocked in every attempt to subpoena people and have them testify. We don't know what information they got. We don't even know which people were in there. We were initially told they only had read access. Then we found out that some of them had write access. We don't know if they exfiltrated information. Every dollar that is paid out of the U.S. Treasury goes through that. Some of the dollars that get paid out of the U.S. Treasury are your Social Security checks, your grant monies, veterans benefits, those sorts of programs. Other things that are paid out of there are any asset we have embedded in a hostile foreign government or a terrorist cell who has risked their life to provide us with intelligence to protect us on our shores. We do not want their information being made public. We don't know whether that information was taken out, but we know that within the Treasury payment system, you can get their bank routing information and their information to make those payments. That is a huge fear that we can't get the answer to. I introduced a bill to essentially close that barn door, and we just need 3 Republicans, and we can close that barn door. But I haven't been able to get 3 Republicans yet to sign onto that bill, so we've got to push that. Number 2, one of the historically, some of the ways that we find out about these problems are through our inspectors general. So inside every part of the government, you have inspectors general, so that if you see that somebody has infiltrated the system, if you see somebody doing some fishy stuff, those inspectors general are there through an act of Congress. They are there to be neutral ombudsman, ombudswoman, who are providing information back to the Congress through secure channels. And to get a sense of what that is, if you're a CIA agent, you can't come forward with what you know, right? Because we don't want people to know what you know. But you have this channel through these inspectors general. When when we found out that in the first Trump administration that he was withholding aid from Ukraine in exchange for political favors, it was the inspectors general that brought that to our attention. One of the first acts the Trump administration did was to fire the inspectors general. That is illegal, but it is a huge vulnerability we have right now that we as members of Congress don't have nonpartisan people to provide that information to us. The third big one that scares us is this obscene Signal chat thread that happened. And I have Signal on my phone. We use it. It's a good system. It is a hackable protocol. It's fairly secure. It's more secure than most, but it's a hackable protocol. Setting that aside, you cannot be, even if you have the world's most secure software, the device itself can be hacked. Because I've seen Mission Impossible. Cut off my finger, you can get into my phone. Right? You shouldn't be having those conversations. Those conversations don't happen except in the SCIF being the secure compartmentalized information room. And so the conversations that these people were having on Signal should never have been happening in any protocol where the information was being shared through non-secure channels. And the fact that no one on that call, including the Vice President of the United States, the head of the National Security Administration, the Director of National Security, the fact that no one piped up and said, children, this is not the channel where we have this conversation, is massively frightening. And to give a sense of how much damage, I don't know how long it will take to fix that. I was recently meeting with a former Deputy Undersecretary at Treasury who did a lot of work with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Unit, where if we want to know, North Koreans, are, paying to develop nuclear programs by doing, cyber attacks on the Colonial Pipeline and stealing money and using these crypto channels. If we want to track all that down, we need to have robust engagement with our foreign partners and intelligence overseas that's tracking these things. The Department of Justice announced that they are not going to enforce the Corporate Transparency Act that allows us to see who these shell companies are, which was a very bipartisan piece of legislation passed 2 terms ago. And what my friend at the Treasury Department said is he recently got a call, after he was out of the White House, got a call from one of his peers within the Israeli government. And this gentleman said, I don't know how long it will take for us to trust the United States enough again to share intelligence. Because even if we have a new administration that's more responsible, how do we know that a future administration is not going to protect these channels because the intelligence stays there? That is a huge problem if we lose that ability to coordinate. It puts all Americans at risk. And, we're making as much noise as we can. I mean, I'm here today. I want to make sure that everybody understands this, and we've got plenty of pieces of legislation that do this. But if Congress is not going to do oversight, why be in Congress, right? We are the legislative branch. If the laws aren't being followed, we have to do oversight. We can't just depend on the courts to fix that, especially stuff that has a fair amount of classified information that you don't want to be released in a courtroom.
I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. For the first time in my life, I'm afraid. I've never had to be afraid before. In fact, I'm enough afraid that when I watched people walk into this room with Trump shirts and MAGA hats, I seriously questioned whether I could get up here and ask my question safely. But it's not just me. It's my marriage, which became legal the day Obergefell was won. It is my friends who are already losing access to their children's gender-affirming medical care. That is not something that's happening in the future. That is not something that only happens in red states. I have talked to at least 2 of them this week who have said they are already losing access to that care. It's the children I talk to at one of our middle schools who tell me that they're afraid and they don't know where to turn. I want to know what do I say to them when they tell me they're afraid? How do I look at my wife and not be afraid? How do I go about my daily life in this world right now when I'm personally seeing so much? Sorry, I can't make it stop. When I'm personally seeing the level of hate on my own Facebook page go up and up and up in a way that I have never experienced before. Tell me how I live right now in this America.
I wish I had an answer that was going to make you feel better and feel totally safe walking out of here, and I can't do that. I think we are keenly aware, particularly as members of Congress, that your job so often is to look out for the most vulnerable among us, right? The people who have things are very loud. They come to our office. They ask us to make sure that they can keep what they have. People who are vulnerable don't, and we find out one of the first projects that we were able to steer money to our district for was 360 Youth Services that provides housing for LGBT kids, not because LGBT kids are more vulnerable to being unhoused, unless LGBT kids are told by your parents, this is too uncomfortable, I don't want you to be around here. And so you see this huge increase in unhoused among the LGBT community, as I don't need to tell you, right? And higher rates of suicide, and what do we do? And so we had steered some money to a group that was provided that housing. When the Republicans took control of Congress, they changed the rules so that we couldn't steer money to those groups anymore. And like whatever you believe, whatever you want to do, however you want to love yourself, that's none of my business. But if you know that there's these populations that are hurt, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, right? The only, I guess, I don't want to say optimism, but hope I can give you is most people who yell on Facebook are not most of the people, right? Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, has this beautiful story he tells about going to Home Depot to do some shopping one day and having somebody follow him around Home Depot yelling at him about what a horrible governor he was. And meanwhile, like a whole bunch of people kept coming up to him and saying, I'm so sorry you have to deal with this. We really appreciate what you're doing. I'm so sorry. And the punchline of his story, he said, we live in a society that screams our hatred and whispers our love. And so I think like the best thing that I can say is like, number one, don't judge somebody for the shirt they're wearing or the sign in their yard. Give them the decency to like before you judge who they are. And and for those of you who've got some love and tolerance in your heart, just be a little louder.
Be kind of convoluted because I have a bunch of things that were on my mind, but so many people have addressed some of them already. One of the things I noticed is the first questions were being concerned. Now the questions are fear. Next, they're going to be terror. And I think what concerns everybody here, at least why I'm here, is because I'm concerned and afraid that nothing is going to change. Nothing's going to be done. Most of the things that are being threatened by the government right now are services. They're not businesses. They're not out there to make money, save money, none of that. And they have nothing to do with this federal deficit, which is an imaginary number that really doesn't mean anything. You can always add more money to it. So we've decided to ignore the services like the Postal Service, the Social Security services, all that, and let it go while people in Congress are just sitting there. I always felt that more than 50% of the people were good and had my interests and interests of the general public in mind. That doesn't seem to be anymore. When you have a Congress that you said, everybody needs to stand up, do you see that happening anytime soon? I know this is a two-part question. The second part is, laws are being broken. The government is told they're being broken. They're told what to do by the judges and the juries, the judicial branch, and they're not doing it. And what's the consequence? There's no consequence. How do you see any consequence from the federal government, the executive branch? Is that the right one? Yeah, anyway, doing whatever they want. Yeah. Because I would imagine everybody in this room is afraid and concerned and soon to be in terror of what's happening.
So my observation over the last 70 days is we've gone from apathy to fear to anger. And I think that's actually healthy because the next thing after anger is action. When I say we, I'm saying the country collectively, right? You're starting to see people, make some noise at the grassroots level and otherwise. I think those of us as elected officials have an obligation to go stand up, to come to places like this. Like that's part of why we're being here. There is a bet that our founders made with our democracy, and I always encourage people to go back, pick your favorite founder, Google their name, quote, and the word virtue. And it is fascinating to see how much our founders talked about how a country based on the rule of law fundamentally depended on having people of virtue in positions of power. Because there's no protection if the person who is tasked with enforcing the law chooses not to enforce the law. And so we've got this situation right now where you have a White House that's breaking the law, a Department of Justice who is not enforcing the law against the White House, a legislative branch who's not doing the oversight, and we're depending on the courts. That is because of the virtue of the people there, but it's a risk that's baked into our democracy. And my favorite quote, and I'm going to garble the quote, so I'm not even going to try to get it exactly right, but before the Constitution was written, James Madison said that to expect that you will only elect virtuous people to be our leaders is a chimerical idea, if I'm pronouncing that right. And therefore, we must trust that the virtue of the people who elect them will stay strong. And so we have to trust that all our neighbors are going to be virtuous because that's the basic bet of democracy. Not just the people in red states or blue states, not just the people who have a yard sign in your yard that you like, but we have to trust that people are fundamentally virtuous or we lose the whole thing. And that's something like that we all have to do, right? It's why I said at the start, like, why am I here? I'm here because I want to make sure that everybody understands what the stakes are, but also that people don't walk out of here and say, I can't trust somebody because they didn't vote for the person who I voted for last time. We have to trust that, like, if everybody's out there and everybody's informed, we get this done. I guess I'll just close with a little story. In March of 2020, just before COVID shut everything down, a group of us went down to walk across the Selma Bridge with John Lewis one last time. We knew that John was not going to be with us for much longer, and he ended up dying, I think, in June or July of that year. And John said one last time, and so we went down, and everybody who was still alive and had walked across that bridge the first time came back to be there. So Ruby Bridges was down walking across the bridges with us. Jim Lawson, who had taught nonviolence to Martin Luther King, was down there with us. The surviving members of the Abernathy family. It was just this amazing group of people. And I'm sitting there as a first-term member of Congress, just in awe of all these people who are here. And I ended up talking with Chuck Neblett, who was one of the Freedom Singers. He'd been involved in some of the Freedom Rides. And I said, as someone in a position of some, hopefully leadership, tell me what I need to learn from these people, because these people somehow found the courage to stand up and do things that they knew people who were lynched for. So number one, how did they find the courage to do that? And number two, how did they articulate that in a way that got other people to stand up and take that same risk. And Chuck said, he said, there's a common mistake that we assume that leaders create movements. It's the other way around. Movements create leaders. And he said, once we had a crowd in the street, we needed to find people who could be out there in the front. But Martin and Rosa, this is his words, Martin and Rosa didn't come first. The movement came first. And then we needed Martin and Rosa. And I said, I said to him, I said, so okay, if that's true, like I'm still trying to figure out, like, so what am I supposed to do with this? So I said, all right, so what created the movement? And he said, look around this room at all of these gray-headed people here. We are all Emmett Till's age. And he said, every one of us, when Mamie Till did that funeral, every one of us was his age. We were at the age where we were invulnerable. We didn't think anybody could stop us. And we stood up and we started marching. We started sitting in at the lunch counters, and that's what created the movement, right? We didn't get the Civil Rights Act in 1964 because John F. Kennedy wanted it, or because Lyndon B. Johnson wanted it. We created it because they didn't have another choice, right? And I think, like, it's why I said before, like, we will get through this to the extent we decide to collectively stand up. But we are all in a constitutional crisis right now.
Good afternoon,
Hi.
Representative Casten. My name is Susan Nicholas, and I am one of the NEA directors from the state of Illinois. I just have a few things. I appreciate the vast viewpoints of people in the audience today who are here to learn from you, from whether they are an independent, a Magna, a Republican, or a Democrat. We are all here as people of Ogle County to do what is best for our nation. And Lee County, sorry, Lee County. I hope we can reach the point once again in this country to have a cup of coffee with Magna Democrats and Republicans to work for the betterment of what this country was founded upon. As an NEA director, I currently lobby with Representative LaHood, Representative Miller, and previously Representative Bost. Like you, I respect Representative LaHood, but I also understand that these people have valid concerns. I have valid concerns as well. Hopefully, in 2 weeks, I will have some of those concerns answered. But I also understand that Republicans and federal employees are in a very precarious situation, one way or the other. What they say and what they do, they're under a microscope that affects you, affects all of us here and throughout the nation. As an educator in Rockford, I teach in a Title I school. My students, like the many educators here and who have had children, our students are our babies, regardless of where they are and where they're from. I'm also a daughter of a retired commander. And I would appreciate if you have any new information that you could share with us regarding the Department of Education, as well as the cuts to our veterans benefits and the health care that is being cut in a random, I don't know, like a jigsaw puzzle order. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So sort of like the first question, we have to answer this with like the law and then the violation of the law. The Department of Education was created by Congress. It was funded by Congress. Under the Constitution, under the Impoundment Control Act, under the Rescission Act, you cannot choose in the White House not to fully fund those obligations consistent with congressional intent in the absence of a subsequent act of Congress. So what they're doing is a violation of the law. The accountability, as all these questions have come up, is the problem. But they cannot do this without breaking the law, and they're breaking the law, and we're trying to make sure that there's accountability. One of the things that we've been doing is trying to make sure that every time congressional letters go out that say we raise our strong concerns with your actions to cut funding for blankety blank, trying to get our colleagues to say that's not the way you write that letter. You write that letter by saying your actions violate code blankety blank, and the penalties for violations of that code are as follows. You have to be a little bit careful because when that works successfully, the person who is then asked to violate the law or lose their job quits. And so there's a real danger that we're trying to grapple through as long as we do not have people of virtue implementing these laws. What the piece to watch next, where this becomes a bigger problem legally, is we are going to go through a budget cycle now, and there's a strong push across the aisle to pass laws that would legitimize these cuts by removing the ability to go back and penalize this. And so, the budget package that just passed the House and the Senate last week on a straight party line vote, they will now have to vote to implement those rules. And you just need to keep making noise and letting people know that this matters to you. And this matters to, this shouldn't be partisan, right? I mean, you got veterans saying, I don't want to have my VA benefits cut. I think if I did my math right, I think in this district there's 150,000 people who depend on Medicaid. If you cut Medicaid, it doesn't just affect those 150,000 people, it affects everybody. Because if you were getting your health care covered at a community health center and now that community health center doesn't have funding, that means you're going to go to the emergency room when you get sick, which means that if any of you suddenly find yourself needing a visit to the emergency room, there may not be beds available. If those Medicaid cuts go through, Medicaid is the single biggest line item in the Illinois budget. The second biggest line item is K through 12 education. So if you force the states to try to cover that hole, you almost inevitably are going to end up with much less state support for education, which, as you know well, is primarily funded by the state, right? So the stuff is it's really, really bad. So far, it's illegal. We need to keep it that way and then make sure that the courts go back to fix it. But it's the time to be in touch with your representatives and remind them that this stuff matters. And again, it should matter to all of us. I mean, one of the things that they cut, and it infuriates me. We passed last term the PACT Act, overwhelmingly bipartisan. This is the thing that Jon Stewart kept coming to D.C. to lobby for. The PACT Act was a bill to say that if you are a Gulf War veteran who was exposed to toxic burn pits prior to the PACT Act, you couldn't get coverage unless you could expressly demonstrate that your conditions were caused by those toxic burn pits. Same deal for Vietnam-era veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. What the PACT Act said is anybody who has these conditions, who served during this period, you will get coverage. And this is the humane thing to do, right? We ask people to sacrifice for our country. We don't pay them that well for doing it, but we tell them that we're going to look after for you and your spouse afterwards. We passed that bill. They defunded it in their bill. How do you go home and look at your kids in the eye and say, Dad did a good job today, right? It's just mean. Right? So make some good trouble. Make some noise.
Hello.
Hi.
In light of the new claimed authority of ICE, what happened to due process? If something could happen to people who are legitimately in this country, what could happen to me as a citizen? The least of these, I'm at a loss.
Yes, I mean, again, it's a straight-up constitutional violation. Due process is your right. This is another one where we need to be careful with the law. And I'll give you an example of something that is going to sound very partisan, the Lake and Riley Act. Lake and Riley, as you know, was this woman who, tragically died, and was an undocumented immigrant involved. The Lake and Riley Act that was passed said that any undocumented person in this country who was accused of a crime, I think it was a minor traffic stop that the perpetrator did, that anybody who's accused is automatically deportable. Well, the law already says that if you are convicted of a crime as an undocumented immigrant, you're deportable. Not only does the law say that, but remember that undocumented immigrants in this country are not just people who snuck across the border. These could be people who are here on temporary protected status, where they came into the United States and I'm going to be persecuted at home. I'm coming here seeking asylum, and our legal system says, okay, we're going to review your case. As a matter of humanity, we're not going to deport you while we review your case. So you are here under temporary protected status. until your case clears. Your case may be decided favorably, it may be decided unfavorably. If you are convicted of a crime during the time you're here, you're out. You got to behave well while you're here. Ditto for dreamers, right? People who came here as infants, they're in the country, they stood up and they said, I'm a dreamer, I want to behave well. Many of these people have served our country, or are working, or paying taxes. And so he said, okay, if you flag yourself as a dreamer, we'll identify you. Now don't get into trouble, but we'll put you on a path to citizenship. These are laws. Lake and Riley says that if those people are simply accused of a crime, they're now deportable. And so when you hear people say, well, due process shouldn't apply to undocumented citizens, those are the people who this affects. And it is hugely problematic, particularly for victims of domestic violence, because imagine what happens if you're sitting there saying, I'm doing everything right, but I am a TPS recipient, I am a dreamer, and I'm in a relationship with someone, and the relationship is now not going so well. All of a sudden, that person gets violent with you and says, if you punch me back, I'll get you deported. Right? Like understand who we are empowering with those rules. There's a reason we have due process. And, as I keep saying on these questions, right now what they're doing is illegal. There are real concerns with the fact that this Congress is trying to make those things legal. You can imagine which way I'm voting on that, by the way.
Hello, my name is May. I am a public school teacher. I teach special education. My husband and I both were able to go to school and graduate college as first-generation college graduates using the Pell Grant to the full extent. Our concerns lie, there's so many things, truthfully, that I could go over, but I want to talk about education and some of the funding, not only to all of the schools, but to our state especially. So, one, Pell Grants are very concerning. And how are people like myself going to be able to go to school and help the community and serve their community? I'm worried about the teacher turn-in thing that they have now federally. If you are a part of DEI, you can go and turn in names. I'm also concerned about the emails that he's sent out saying if you are participating in DEI to public schools, we're not going to fund you anymore. The school district that I work for has $1.77 million in Title I funding. If that's cut, it's going to be we're dismantled. I don't know what our school is going to do. That doesn't include any special education or related services that schools receive. So those are my concerns. And then also, after the funding freeze, we were supposed to get in Illinois $1.88 billion was frozen. I know that Lauren Underwood and some other people wrote a letter saying to Trump, you can't withhold this still. A judge said that you can't withhold this, and I haven't heard anything about that. And now we're having another $165 million cut to Illinois, which I'm sure is going to affect things like Head Start programs and, any grants for cities. All of these things affect people's daily lives. How do we mitigate this?
So I want to try not to keep repeating what I've been saying before, but let me just talk about what we should be doing from a policy perspective and what we got very close to doing last term. So the United States was the first country in the world to provide universal K through 12 education. And a lot of what truly made America great, in the post-war era was that we had the most highly educated workforce of any country. Because we made sure that everybody went through, did we do it perfectly? Of course not. But the basic structure that we came up with, with heavy on local funding, but made sure that everybody had access to an education. As we have seen the United States sort of start to fall a little bit down the league tables of the skill level in the workforce and some other things. A lot of that's been because, like any business, right? You do a thing that is super innovative, and pretty soon your competitors copy you, right? And so it raised the bar for everybody else, and so a lot of other countries said we're going to do that too. And you then saw other countries, and the ones that surpassed us were ones that said, okay, K through 12 is really important, but we need to expand this out a little bit. And so so if you live in Denmark, we include all your college as well, right? You've got places that have included pre-K in that package. When we were working on what this was in Build Back Better, and ultimately we couldn't get it through the Senate, and it got skinnied down. But we basically said, let's, just as the rest of the world copied us, we need to now copy best practices from them and expand to get universal pre-K. And we had in there at least 2 years of community college, so you could come to Sauk, right, and at least start to get some associate's degrees on the back end. Ultimately, we couldn't get that through, but that's what we should be doing, right? And I think the fear on the backside is we could backslide to what we had before the United States put these rules in place, where families of means who could afford to hire tutors could go through and do this, but otherwise you can't afford it. And it's sort of like, as I don't mean to pander to you as a teacher, but I guarantee you we don't pay you as much as you deserve. Right? But if we lived in a society where teaching was all on an a la carte basis, you would have more negotiating leverage, but you also wouldn't be in a position where you say, I'm going to help out all the Title I students because they're not going to pay as well, right? And so it would create just a hugely bifurcated economy that would set us back. So it's just from a purely selfish, I want America to be the leader of the free world, we should be protecting this stuff. And I guess the last thing I'll just leave you with to get some sense of it was ever thus. There's a wonderful speech that James Baldwin gave in 1958, because it's always been the same issue. It's called A Talk to Teachers. If you look it up, it was somewhere up in Minnesota. But Google James Baldwin Talk to Teachers. And he has this line in it where he says, the ultimate purpose of education is to teach people how to ask questions of themselves. What is up? What is down? What is black? What is white? Is there a God in heaven or not? And society only moves forward to the extent that we have people who are asking those questions. And the trouble is no society really wants that type of person around. and it was just this fast. He was like, society we have certain beliefs, fictions we tell ourselves that hold us together as a society. We were founded by people who came here to have a nice lunch with the natives, and they all got along very well, right? It's a nice myth. It holds us together. Not entirely true, but the myth is nice, right? And so education has always been universal education has always been a politically controversial idea. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it.
My name is Robert Wendt. I'm a retired Postal employee. I want to, first of all, emphasize this, since the current administration doesn't seem to understand it, that the U.S. Postal Service is just that, a service. It is not a corporation. Before, when they went on strike in 1970, they reorganized the Postal Service, and they just said, listen here, just have it operate separately. Just leave it, it's part of government, yet it operates separately. Just leave it alone and all that. And, we've become the most trusted government agency, and yet we have this current administration meddling in it and claim they're, listen, the fact is that concerns me because UPS and FedEx depend on us. Mm-hmm. It's also in the Constitution that you have to provide a post office, and is anything being done to to make sure that these people get the message? Listen, leave the post office alone.
There's a little bit of a fever we're in right now. But last, I think it was last term, might have been 2 terms ago, we did pass, and again, this was very bipartisan, to fix the pension issues at the post office. There was this piece, you're familiar with this, but for the rest of the audience, there was this weird thing in the post office that said, I think this was like a law passed under the George W. Bush administration, that said that the post office had to fully fund their pension before they had any additional free cash flow, which no other business does, right? I mean, you fund, you pay enough into the pension to make sure that you got it when you need it, but they had to fully fund. And so it was creating this fiction of postal insolvency in the post office that was purely an accounting fiction. And so we did pass, I think it was very bipartisan, to change the accounting rules to match what the rest of the private sector does. And that gave more financial freedom to the Postal Service so that it wasn't as constrained. There does continue to be this effort to sort of privatize everything. And, I go back to what I said about, Ronald Reagan's head of the Civil Aviation Administration. The process of deregulation shifts the burden from price setting, price of a stamp, to antitrust enforcement. Well, if all of a sudden you were to sell the post office to UPS, they would be a giant monopoly. Right? That ain't antitrust enforcement. But as you said, like, they use you all for the hard to deliver routes. It's easy to run a postal service. In my district in suburban Chicago, the houses are pretty close to each other. It's something else to say, how are you going to mail something to someone in Alaska? And that was Benjamin Franklin's great idea, that if we're going to be one country, we've got to be able to communicate with each other as one country, especially a country as big and as diverse as ours. And I keep relying on other people's quotes, but there's lots of people who've been smarter than me in this line of work, so I might as well steal their material. Thomas Paine, when he was trying to convince Americans to think of themselves as Americans and not as South Carolinians and Virginians, because he wanted them to sign off on the Constitution, had this beautiful line that he said, "Our great title is as Americans, our lesser title varies with the place. It is by our greater title we are known around the world, and by our lesser title we're known at home." The Postal Service is core to that, right? Because if you and I can communicate for the price of a first-class stamp just as well as I can communicate with my neighbor next door for the price of a first-class stamp, just as well as I can communicate with someone in Honolulu for the price of a first-class stamp, then we have seen ourselves as Americans. If my ability to communicate with you is a function of what UPS is going to charge for that one versus this one, then pretty soon I'm an Illinoisan, you're a Hawaiian, you're a Virginian, and we've lost the thing that's made us great.
Yeah, I want to thank you. There's a gap between what we understand is going on in Congress and to get straight answers, so your reach and articulation is good. Thank you. So my question is about martial law. I foresee some problems emerging. We have 300 to 500 people showing up in Sterling for a march. Across the country, we're talking, I don't know the statistics, maybe 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people are doing this sort of thing. And as the colleges started to come on, because they're being challenged in a lot of different areas, there's going to be much larger groups. Somewhere in that process, there may be some things that happen. I was 30 miles from Kent State when that happened at a college. That was horrible. My question is, can he declare martial law as the groups start to emerge larger and larger? We have a lot of white-haired people here tonight, and I think the groups are going to get younger and larger, and some things may happen in some of those. So far, they've been peaceful. Can he declare martial law if he wants to?
I hope we never have to find out. Madeleine Albright, before she died, had written a book called Fascism, and she came and met with a number of us when she was on her book tour. It's one of the perks of Congress, you get to meet with these interesting people. And she told us at the time that her observation is that she differentiates between fascism and authoritarianism, that in an authoritarian government, the leader seizes all the weapons. In a fascist government, they give all the weapons to their political allies. And she said that, like, one of the things to watch for in a society, and what scares me, I have faith in our men and women in uniform. They take an oath to the Constitution, not an oath to the president. They are trained to follow a direct order, but they also, if you go to war college, you've been schooled in the Nuremberg trials that at some point I was following orders is not unacceptable. And when we'll find out where that goes, I also have faith because people like former Joint Chiefs head Mark Milley, Trump-appointed Mark Milley, is out there on the hustings telling everybody, including a group I was in a couple weeks ago, that we train our law enforcement officers to keep the peace. We do not train the military to keep the peace. We train them how to kill people. And when you put military people in a peacekeeping job, no matter how good your intentions, bad things are going to happen. Witness Kent State, right? And I think you've got a lot of discipline of that in the organization. What makes me much more nervous is, freeing the January 6 attackers who attacked police, right? What message does that send? And I will tell you candidly, I have, afraid to stand up because they know that if they do, there's the chance that those people are going to be outside their house. And I get the fear. I've had people like that outside my house in the course of my time in Congress as well. I understand the fear. We shouldn't be asking people in public office to have to assume that degree of courage, but it is a requirement of the job right now. And I just think all of us need to keep reminding, especially people who are, in law enforcement, in the military, connected with people who are there, to keep reminding that there's a reason why we take the oath to the Constitution and not to a king.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question. I have actually two questions, but I'll be brief. So I'm from Sterling, Illinois, and I was just wondering, just to explain, maybe you don't know, Sterling, Illinois at one time had a really great Northwestern Steel and Wire company, and it was in Sterling itself, and in 1970, long time ago, had a population of 16,700. Most recent census, it's down to 14,100. The Northwestern Steel and Wire had financial struggles because of foreign competition steel. Mm-hmm. That was kind of a big deal for our community, and it filed bankruptcy. Jobs went away, families went away, and really kind of the town changed completely. Not for the good either. So I'm wondering, my question is, and it wasn't just Northwestern Steel and Wire, it was once called the hardware capital of the world. And it was booming. I mean, I was just a little kid at that time, but I remember we had everything. People were happy. People were shopping. It was robust. Would the tariffs that they're trying to enact, and would that bring back American jobs? Would that be helpful? Or is it this total, it's going to just be completely bad for the country? And then my second question is, what is being done with Congress to recruit, support the military, our military?
Okay. So I guess I'd sort of describe the tariffs as it's like taking a chainsaw into a cabinet making shop. It is a saw. You can use it to cut wood, but it's massively oversized for the job that you need to do. I mentioned that I was 20 years in the energy industry. I used to run a manufacturer in western Massachusetts in an abandoned mill town. There wasn't much left in that town. It was a good place to have a business. Property taxes were low. But, if we think of Massachusetts as a very blue state, but Massachusetts is essentially a very blue city, some very blue college towns, and a lot of old abandoned mill towns in the middle that aren't around anymore. And, I think a part of that is, technology changed, right? The textile manufacturing, we don't use as much paper anymore. That hurt the paper mill towns. A part of that, candidly, was NAFTA, that I think we basically took a decision as a society, for better or for worse, that we want things to be cheap, and as long as they're cheap, we're going to ignore what happens to the middle class in between. And those were government decisions. They were also decisions that all of us sort of had some agency in, right? Because we all like cheaper stuff. I teased some friends in the solar industry recently because when the Biden administration had put big tariffs on imported solar cells from China, they said, this is going to really drive up our cost of materials, and we're not going to be able to build these projects anymore. And I said, okay, so are you pro or con Chinese slave labor? Right? Because, do you want that to be cheap at all costs, or is there some point where we say we can't keep hollowing out the middle class? to provide these things back. And I think there's plenty of room for a very thoughtful policy with our trading partners that says if you're naturally better at this than I am, you have some competitive advantage. Capitalism works. Let's make sure you make it. If you're only better at this because we're going to pay you $15 an hour, but if you go across the border, you can pay 80 cents an hour. We haven't done anything other than destroy a community. And so I think there's an appropriate for targeted tariff policy that addresses that. One of the things that we did with a lot of intentionality in the Inflation Reduction Act was we put additional tax credits for anybody building facilities in communities that are transitioning away. So if you look at I think about this from an energy lens. West Virginia has one of the highest rates of opioid use in the country, one of the lowest life expectancies in the country. On every metric, they're doing really bad. West Virginia 50 years ago was doing pretty well because of the coal industry, and they never really transitioned away from coal. And coal at this point is more expensive as a fuel source. There's been a huge collapse in coal demand, but we didn't do things to transition. And we tell ourselves these stories that every technology advance has created more jobs than it destroys. And that's generally true, but it doesn't create jobs for the people who lost them, right? It creates jobs for different types of people. And I think we have to be thoughtful enough not to say to somebody who is 55, who worked in that factory and was 6 years away from retirement, to say, good news, you can go back to community college and learn how to code. Right? It's just disrespectful. And, I guess what I'd say to all of us is that you remember the story about John Henry who killed himself fighting the steam shovel? You can love steam shovels and love John Henry. Right? And I just think we have to do that with the way our policies work. The reason why I say that the tariffs are taking a chainsaw to a cabinet maker is these tariffs are going to raise the average American household's cost by $4,700 a person. It's actually worse than that because if there's stuff that you needed that you now can't buy, your costs are going to be much bigger than that. And they're not targeted, and they certainly aren't consistent. I couldn't tell you. The start of last week, I thought the tariffs were very different than they are now, and I can't tell you what they're going to be next week. Businesses can't plan for that, and it's not very targeted, but we can do better. With respect to the second part of your question with our military, you can decide whether this is good or bad. The budget proposal from the White House and the budget proposal that came out of the House and Senate said we need to give $4.5 trillion of tax cuts to our nation's wealthiest. And in order to pay for that, we will not touch the Department of Defense or Social Security. Department of Defense and Social Security are 85% of the total federal budget. So we are going to, if you just take that budget on its face, and this has to be, it has to be enabling law. If you just take that budget on its face, we are going to still have a very well-funded military. Whether we can recruit the best and brightest is going to be hard to tell because we're telling people that if you're not a straight white guy, you're probably a DEI hire, and that's sending good people out of our military, and it's making it harder to recruit and retain people. The fact that what's left to cut has had these huge, the cuts I mentioned before to the Veterans Affairs and the support we provide our veterans. I think it's going to make it much harder to recruit and retain people if we don't tell them that in exchange for your service, we're going to make sure that you've got a life of dignity on the back end. And so a lot of those cuts, I think, are going to make it very difficult to recruit. But at least as it sits right now, we're going to continue to build expensive military hardware. The last thing I'd say is just to quote, again, Mark Milley, the former Joint Chiefs of Staff. He famously told Trump in his first term that if you're going to cut $1 out of the State Department, you better be prepared to give me 10. Because every time we dial back on our soft power abroad, it increases the risk of further military conflict. So like stuff that USAID was doing to go into countries that, think of the United States as being the place where we're providing cheaper food, we're building schools for kids in need. That's all shut down right now. which makes those people, A, much more vulnerable, and B, much more receptive when Putin or Xi comes knocking at the door and says, I see the United States isn't here anymore. What can I offer you?
Holding the microphone is that I get to ask the last question. This is my payment for standing up here. So we have a substantial activist group in this community. Many of those people are here in this room today. We have met almost every single week since before you were elected. We started meeting in November of 2016. We've hosted protests, lots of protests, but particularly since February, some very well-attended protests. We've sent maybe tens of thousands of postcards. We've regularly, as you probably know, called our Congress people and written them letters. We have worked very hard for candidates, some of whom, hi Lisa, are in this room, and we've worked very, very hard. But we feel sometimes we are the forgotten people, because all this community was represented by Adam Kinzinger. In all the years he represented us, he never, ever held a town hall, despite all of our requests. Representative LaHood has received thousands of phone calls and received a petition with several thousand signatures on it requesting him to do a town hall. It is so wonderful to see a real, live congressman in our community. We are so grateful to you for meeting with us and for answering our various questions. And my question is, quite simply, what more can we do? Because we need to do more. People in this room are anxious, they're worried, they're fearful, and they want to do something every day. If I say, sorry, we're not going to have a protest tomorrow, you know how many emails I get? So, what more can we do?
Well, number one, thank you all for having me. I truly, I have like a weird, I don't think I have a lot of substance abuse problems, but I'm addicted to town halls. I mentioned that my predecessor hadn't had one in 10 years. In the 6 years I've been in, I think we've had 85 so far. We average about one we've averaged one a month. They've gotten more frequent in the Trump era. But one of the things that I'm sort of thinking about, what more can you do? One of the things that I have found, and part of the reason why I love town halls so much, is that there are increasingly few points in our society where we walk into a physical room and sitting next to somebody who we don't know who they are, we don't know whether we agree with them, but we agree to engage respectfully with each other, right? A number of years ago, I was speaking at an interfaith prayer breakfast, and I said, I think the only three places where that still happens are interfaith prayer breakfasts, Bruce Springsteen concerts, and my town halls. And we've tried to be intentional about doing events on the most controversial issues of the day. So when we were first considering the first impeachment against Donald Trump, I did a town hall on impeachment. And I just come in, I'd flipped a seat that had been Republican for 50 years. I was not seen as being particularly safe in my political future. And I remember one of the Chicago newspapers said, Casten's on a suicide mission. And there were a lot of people in the room in full MAGA gear, and every single person, not everybody agreed, but everybody exactly as today asked questions and was respectful and engaged and was treated respectfully. And the part that I still get chills thinking about it is this person came up to me at the end and said, I don't agree with your perspective, but you gave us a lesson in how civil society is supposed to work today. And I'm not saying that to ask for your praise or to brag or anything else, but I think I think all of us have a role to try to create rooms like this where we can. We can do it in the context of winning an election, but now immediately there's a my way or your way. But I think if you just actually sit down and sit with people and ask people, do you think the good guys won the Civil War? Do you think the good guys won the Cold War? Do you think the Enlightenment was a step forward in human progress? Do you want the United States to be the leader of the free world? There's a lot of agreement right, on those issues. And I think to the extent we can just, get to that point, and I guess, how you do that, you'll figure out. I don't claim you understand your community vastly better than I did, but there was this beautiful article in the Atlantic a couple months ago, and the gist of the quote that I remember from it was he said, our families teach us love, our tribes teach us loyalty, but only the village teaches us tolerance. And we just need to create those moments where we can tolerate each other, learn from each other, come out a little bit smarter, come out a little bit challenged, and it's the only way we move forward. So, like I said before, spread that love as loud as you can. Thank you. Thank you.
That's where we're going to end this today, folks. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today in a respectful manner. I appreciate it. Thank you, Congressman Casten, for coming out. Have a good day, everyone.